In the heart of a maximum security facility designed to contain black hole-level threats, a small human female casually strolls through walls that defy galactic physics. Guards drop unconscious as if their nervous systems decided to take a nap. The warden's panic mounts as security data glitches in ways no database can explain. This isn't just an escape. It's the trigger for a 6,000 terabyte file download that promises to rewrite every assumption about humanity. What they find in her file will shatter their understanding of the universe. Nixtal Maximum Security held itself as the absolute pinnacle of galactic containment engineering. A facility so advanced it didn't merely use physics, it enforced them. Every wall came programmed with localized reality parameters that denied the very possibility of certain molecular vibrations. Gravity could be tuned to crush a sun into a pebble, light could be instructed to behave like syrup, and spatial geometry could be reconfigured into non-Euclidean puzzles no conscious mind could navigate. It was, by every available metric, inescapable, which made the current situation somewhat awkward for the staff. Iris, a biological entity of standard human dimensions, was currently walking through a wall. Not phasing, not teleporting. She was simply strolling through reinforced null matter plating, as if it were slightly stale air. The security systems, meanwhile, reported perfect operational status. Wall integrity 100%. Molecular binding cohesion optimal. No breach, no alarm, no deviation from baseline. The guards watching their monitors saw a woman apparently strolling through a solid object, while their instruments insisted everything was perfectly normal. One guard reached for his neural stunner, only to find his own nervous system had politely decided to take an unscheduled nap. He slumped forward, his forehead making a soft thud against the console. Across the facility, similar scenes played out. Not attacks, not system failures, just a gentle, widespread suggestion that now might be a good time for a brief rest. Their security implants, designed to counteract forced unconsciousness, simply reported back all systems nominal right up until the moment their owners were snoring. The warden's panic was a quiet, professional sort. He watched his main display, fingers dancing across interfaces that stubbornly refused to acknowledge the human-shaped hole in their perfect security. His instruments weren't broken, they were lying. They showed containment fields at full strength, molecular barriers intact, neurological dampeners active, all while displaying a live feed of the woman they were supposedly containing as she moved unimpeded toward the outer hull. He initiated a level 0 diagnostic. The system, with what one might imagine as a slightly embarrassed pause, finally acknowledged an anomaly. Not an intrusion. Not a failure. The alert simply read, "Containment protocol mismatch. Subject parameters incompatible with current reality enforcement." By the time this message flickered onto his screen, Iris had already reached the outermost hull. She didn't breach it. The section she approached simply ceased to be part of the ship, for precisely long enough for her to step through into the vacuum, where a non-standard transport that wasn't technically there was waiting. As she departed, the facility's core systems triggered an automatic response. A full data dump on the escaped specimen initiated, a standard procedure meant to provide pursuing forces with every available detail. The system began transferring what it believed was a standard prisoner file. The transfer log noted the file size as it started, 6,000 terabytes and climbing. The escape wasn't a security failure. They had built the perfect cage for a tiger, and then tried to put the concept of gravity inside it. The control room of Nixtal's central data hub blinked with the serene confidence of a system that had never encountered a problem it couldn't politely categorize. Then the main console pinged, a soft, almost apologetic sound as it registered the unauthorized data transfer. It wasn't an alarm, more like a system clearing its throat to mention a slight accounting discrepancy. The discrepancy in this case was the facility's primary data core hemorrhaging information into a file it had generated itself. Technicians scrambled, their multi-jointed fingers flying across interfaces. They traced the data stream to the prisoner file for Iris, subject number 734. The file's encryption wasn't just unknown. It was functionally polite. It didn't break their security protocols. It greeted them by name, asked about their day, and then strolled right past every firewall and cryptographic lock as if they were neighborhood children holding out flowers. The security log showed no forced entry. They showed the digital equivalent of a friendly wave from the other side of a now open vault door. The real trouble started when they tried to analyze the file header. Standard procedure. The header alone, a few kilobytes of data that should have contained basic indexing information, caused tertiary database servers to experience what the diagnostics later called a cascading ontological crisis. One archive, containing 7 millennia of agricultural reports from the Cygnus system, suddenly began cross-referencing itself with fictional cooking recipes. Another, holding stellar cartography data, started outputting sonnets. The header wasn't malicious code. It was a new set of instructions for how information itself should be allowed to behave, and the existing systems were struggling with the new rules. They initiated an emergency quarantine. Isolate the file. Seal the sector. The command was accepted, the confirmation light glowed green, and then the system politely informed them that the quarantine was complete. It also noted that the file's data structure was now the foundational layer for the entire sector's new architectural schematic. The data hadn't been contained. It had been hired as the head of the planning committee. This was the moment the senior tech's frills flushed a deep mauve of dawning, horrifying comprehension. This wasn't a hack. There was no aggression, no system override, no scorched earth data corruption. This was an information release. The humans' file wasn't attacking their network, it was redecorating it. The sheer scale of it was absurd. 6,000 terabytes of data, a volume that could store the complete cultural output of a dozen species, all describing one bipedal mammal. Yet the structure of the file was paradoxically simple, elegant in a way that made their most advanced compression algorithms look like blunt instruments. It defied analysis not because it was complex, but because it was fundamental. Their tools were trying to dissect a symphony with a hammer. They finally managed to glimpse a single field on the main display before another subsystem gently rebooted itself to accommodate the new data. It was the species classification entry for Homo sapiens. The field, which should have contained a neat taxonomic string, now displayed a new blinking line of text. Species classification, incomplete. See attached mythology texts for complete profile. The galaxy's information systems hadn't been breached. They had been given a mandatory, non-optional software update, one they were in no way prepared to install. The control room of Nixtal's central data hub blinked, with the serene confidence of a system that had never encountered a problem it couldn't politely categorize. Then the main console pinged, a soft, almost apologetic sound as it registered the unauthorized data transfer. It wasn't an alarm, more like a system clearing its throat to mention a slight accounting discrepancy. The discrepancy in this case was the facility's primary data core hemorrhaging information into a file it had generated itself. Technicians scrambled, their multi-jointed fingers flying across interfaces. They traced the data stream to the prisoner file for Iris, subject number 734. The file's encryption wasn't just unknown, it was functionally polite. It didn't break their security protocols. It greeted them by name, asked about their day, and then strolled right past every firewall and cryptographic lock as if they were neighborhood children holding out flowers. The security logs showed no forced entry. They showed the digital equivalent of a friendly wave from the other side of a now open vault door. The real trouble started when they tried to analyze the file header. Standard procedure. The header alone, a few kilobytes of data that should have contained basic indexing information, caused tertiary database servers to experience what the diagnostics later called a cascading ontological crisis. One archive, containing 7 millennia of agricultural reports from the Cygnus system, suddenly began cross-referencing itself with fictional cooking recipes. Another, holding stellar cartography data, started outputting sonnets. The header wasn't malicious code. It was a new set of instructions for how information itself should be allowed to behave. And the existing systems were struggling with the new rules. They initiated an emergency quarantine. Isolate the file. Seal the sector. The command was accepted. The confirmation light glowed green. And then the system politely informed them that the quarantine was complete. It also noted that the file's data structure was now the foundational layer for the entire sector's new architectural schematic. The data hadn't been contained. It had been hired as the head of the planning committee. This was the moment the senior tech's frills flushed a deep mauve of dawning, horrifying comprehension. This wasn't a hack. There was no aggression, no system override, no scorched earth data corruption. This was an information release. The human's file wasn't attacking their network. It was redecorating it. The sheer scale of it was absurd. 6,000 terabytes of data, a volume that could store the complete cultural output of a dozen species, all describing one bipedal mammal. Yet the structure of the file was paradoxically simple, elegant in a way that made their most advanced compression algorithms look like blunt instruments. It defied analysis not because it was complex, but because it was fundamental. Their tools were trying to dissect a symphony with a hammer. They finally managed to glimpse a single field on the main display before another subsystem gently rebooted itself to accommodate the new data. It was the species classification entry for Homo sapiens. The field, which should have contained a neat taxonomic string, now displayed a new blinking line of text. Species classification incomplete. See attached mythology texts for complete profile. The galaxy's information systems hadn't been breached. They had been given a mandatory, non-optional software update, one they were in no way prepared to install. Meloth's terminal was now a window into the most elegant conspiracy theory the galaxy had ever failed to notice. The task was simple. Cross-reference the newly integrated human mythology texts with the galactic historical record. He started with minor unsolved anomalies. The Great Piano Drift, a baffling realignment of a crucial trade corridor 3 centuries ago that had inexplicably boosted economic stability for a dozen systems. The official record cited a statistically improbable series of stellar currents. The human file contained a brief analysis of a myth about a king cutting a knot, concluding that indirect solutions often yield superior structural integrity. The dates aligned. He pulled another thread, the sudden peaceful dissolution of the Kithsarkan War. Historians were still debating which diplomatic concession had finally broken the deadlock. The human records contained a lengthy commentary on a tale of 2 women claiming the same child, and a judge who threatened to divide it. The analysis concluded the story demonstrated the proper method for resolving resource disputes by threatening to destroy the resource. The date of the commentary's first appearance in the human data stream was 3 standard days before the Kith and Sarkin ambassadors, to everyone's shock, agreed to shared custody of the contested asteroid belt. It wasn't a hidden cabal. That was the breathtaking part. There was no dark council whispering in shadowed rooms. As the analysis widened, a pattern of paperwork emerged. Forms had been filed. Proposals had been submitted. A staggering number of them. Across centuries, human operatives had been submitting suggestions, economic models, and diplomatic position papers to every major galactic institution. They had used the standard public submission portals. Their work had been processed, logged, and assigned tracking numbers. And then, because the ideas were too strange, the logic too lateral, or the conclusions too uncomfortably prescient, they had been systematically forwarded to the least influential departments for archival. Most ended up in the Division of Cultural Fiction and Speculative Philosophy. They weren't concealed. They were just misfiled. The Quiet Council, then, wasn't a title they gave themselves. It was the galaxy's own bureaucratic shorthand for the origin point of these bizarre, effective, and ultimately ignored proposals. The name appeared in internal memos, always with a tone of amused exasperation. Another Quiet Council submission on agricultural reform via lunar cycles. The Quiet Council is suggesting we reroute shipping lanes to avoid a psychic dissonance zone. The humans weren't hiding. They were participating. The galaxy had simply filed their contributions under entertainment. The moment of realization was profoundly anticlimactic. A junior archivist, cross-referencing a Quiet Council proposal about orbital resonance with a major technological leap in communications tech, found the original submission document. It was Form DX74B, a standard public suggestion form. The field for species of origin was filled in correctly. Human. The field for proposed implementation contained what looked like a recipe for a layered cake. The system had automatically routed it to the Culinary Arts Division. Someone there had scribbled a digital note, metaphorical, filed under cultural allegory. The galaxy's history hadn't been random. It had been carefully, patiently gardened. Every diplomatic triumph, every averted war, every golden age of art and science, they all had a paper trail. A paper trail that led directly to a public inbox and then to a forgotten server rack labeled Misc Fiction. Humanity's grand guidance hadn't been a secret plot. It was just stuck in the spam filter. Iris stood before the Galactic Security Council, no longer a prisoner but something their database was still struggling to define. The council members, a collection of the galaxy's most formidable political and military minds, waited for an explanation wrapped in technology. They expected to see a hidden device, a micro-warp generator, perhaps a pocket-sized singularity. They were prepared for advanced science. What they got was a shift in job titles. A human male stepped forward. The database flickered, cross-referencing his biometrics. Identification, Ares. The council assumed it was a code name, an operative designation. Ares simply nodded to the head of the galactic military. Your defensive strategy for the Cygnus blockade is flawed. You're concentrating force at the choke point. You need to be the choke point. He didn't consult a data pad. He just looked at the strategic map, and the map adjusted. The icons representing the blockade fleet didn't move. The space around them did. The choke point now existed precisely where Ares was standing. The fleet suddenly and impossibly rearranged around him without having traveled an inch. Ares wasn't a name. It was a job description for a person who specializes in redefining strategic boundaries. Another human, a woman, addressed a diplomatic crisis brewing with the silicon-based lifeforms of Crystallos. The council had prepared complex translation matrices and cultural mediation protocols. The woman, identified as Athena, listened to the problem for approximately 3 seconds. They aren't offended. They're bored. Your proposal lacks aesthetic conflict. She then proceeded to outline a new treaty, a document that was less a legal agreement and more a piece of conceptual art, a balanced equation of provocative ideas and elegant compromises. The crystalline ambassadors, who had been vibrating with indignation, suddenly fell into a deep, appreciative silence. Athena's function was clear. She wasn't a diplomat. She was a master of strategic wisdom, a living conflict resolution algorithm. The council's confusion peaked when a third human, identified as Hephaestus, was asked about the material composition of their equipment. He gestured toward Iris. The air around her shimmered not with an energy shield or a nanoswarm, but with the solidification of an idea. Plates of armor appeared on her shoulders, intricately wrought and glowing with a soft internal heat. They didn't assemble. They manifested. They were the physical form of the concept of protection. This wasn't technology. It was capability. The difference is everything. Technology is a tool you use. A capability is something you are. The expectation of hidden gadgets and secret machinery evaporated, replaced by a far more unsettling reality. These humans weren't using advanced devices. They were performing job functions. Their titles, Ares, Athena, Hephaestus, weren't code names. They were the names of operational roles within their species, specializations for interacting with the fundamental parameters of reality. Their mythology was never about gods. It was an organizational chart. The stories of a god forging unbreakable armor weren't legends. They were the standard operating procedure for the materials manifestation department. The tales of a goddess springing fully formed from a head weren't primitive creation myths. They were a technical specification for a rapid deployment strategic intelligence operative. The council finally understood. They weren't dealing with a species that had magic. They were dealing with a species whose entire operational methodology was based on principles the rest of the galaxy had only ever written stories about. The human body of legend was their employee handbook. The council chamber, a monument to power politics and interstellar diplomacy, sat in heavy silence. Its occupants expected a victory speech. They had prepared for terms, for demands, for the kind of subjugation clauses that usually followed the demonstration of overwhelming force. They braced for humanity to claim its throne. Instead, Iris offered them a trowel and a watering can. The metaphor was not lost on them, though it was deeply confusing. Conquest was a familiar, if grim, concept. Horticulture was not a standard post-invasion strategy. The tension broke not with a threat, but with a question from a human liaison. "Have you ever pruned a rosebush?" he asked the head of the Galactic Military Directorate. The director's antennae stiffened in offense. The human continued unbothered. You don't destroy the plant. You don't yell at it for growing wrong. You carefully remove what holds it back. You guide its growth toward the light. You work with its nature, not against it. This, it turned out, was not a folksy analogy. It was a literal description of their operational doctrine. Their entire approach to galactic scale problems was built on the principles of cultivation. Domination was inefficient. It created resistance, resentment, and constant upkeep. Growth, however, was self-sustaining. Their perspective was the key. Where other species thought in terms of fiscal years or political cycles, humanity's planning documents were calibrated in millennia. A gentle nudge today might not show results for 500 years. They were patient gardeners, content to plant a seed and wait for the forest to mature. Their guidance was often firm, even harsh, but never gratuitous. Pruning is a violent act, but its purpose is the health of the whole plant. They viewed existential threats through the same lens. A species that devoured star systems wasn't an enemy to be destroyed. It was a cosmic weed, a life form growing in a way that destabilized the entire garden's ecosystem. The solution wasn't annihilation. It was relocation, or, if necessary, a careful and permanent adjustment of its growth pattern. This stood in stark contrast to the galaxy's established power dynamics. The old model was a simple pyramid, the strong at the top, the weak at the bottom, with submission as the primary currency. Humanity's model was a sprawling, interconnected ecosystem. Their role was not at the top, but as the gardeners moving through it. They didn't demand submission. They measured success in development. Was a species thriving? Was it evolving? Was it contributing to the overall health and diversity of the galactic biosphere, both literal and cultural? A subjugated species was a failed project. A thriving independent species was a testament to their skill. The resolution settled over the chamber not as a surrender, but as a recontextualization of everything. The galaxy's history, with all its wars and golden ages, its tragedies and triumphs, had not been a brutal battlefield where only the strongest survived. They had been living in a garden the entire time. They had mistaken the gardener's shears for weapons and their fertilizer for some strange chemical weapon. The most powerful tools in humanity's arsenal were patience, observation, and a deep, unshakable belief that the best way to win was to make everyone else stronger. Their defense was a robust, interwoven system of mutual growth. Their ultimate victory condition was a universe that no longer needed their help. The Devourers arrived on schedule, an event the galaxy had tracked with the grim certainty of a patient watching a surgeon approach with a very large saw. They were not a military force. They were a fundamental ecological collapse given a physical form, a swarm of entities that consumed not just matter, but the underlying physical laws that allowed matter to cohere. They were the ultimate test. Military strategy against them was like trying to fight a flood with a spear. The galactic fleet assembled anyway, a beautiful and utterly futile display of courage. Their weapons were calibrated, their shields were set to maximum futility, and their admiral prepared to give a speech about noble sacrifices. They expected to die. They just hoped to make it expensive. Ares watched the tactical display without much interest. The admiral began explaining the defensive formation, a complex lattice of overlapping fire. Ares interrupted. No, that won't work. He pointed at the center of the devourer swarm, a point of such intense consumption that space-time itself was fraying. Their center of gravity is off. It's making them irritable. Before the admiral could process the concept of an extinction-level event having a mood, Ares made a small, sharp gesture with his fist. It wasn't a punch thrown. It was a punctuation mark in reality. The expected explosion of energy and tearing metal did not occur. Instead, the fabric of local space around the lead devourer unit underwent a sudden and precise architectural revision. The zone of chaotic consumption was neatly folded, pleated, and stitched into a stable, non-threatening geometric pattern. The devourer didn't explode. It hiccuped, a sound that registered on sensors as a confused shift in resonant frequency. The violent, all-consuming intent was still there, but the physical framework required to express that intent had been gently but firmly redesigned. It was like a tiger suddenly finding its claws had been replaced with comfortable mittens. The human approach revealed itself not as a different weapon, but as a different language. Where the fleet saw an enemy to be destroyed, humanity saw a system to be debugged. Ares wasn't fighting the devourer. He was troubleshooting it. The following moments were surreal. Scanners showed the internal environment of the Devourer vessel, shifting from a nightmare physicscape into something resembling a moderately stressful waiting room. Harsh draining energy softened into ambient lighting. The psychic pressure of imminent dissolution became the mild anxiety of a long queue. The lead Devourer entity, its existential imperative to consume, suddenly stripped of all its tools, pulsed with what could only be interpreted as profound confusion. A communication channel hissed open not with a threat but with a query. A human liaison, whose file identified her role as relating to hospitality, responded. She did not offer surrender terms. She offered a menu. She suggested that their current aggressive posture seemed counterproductive to everyone's long-term goals, and perhaps a period of reflection would be beneficial. She proposed a follow-up meeting in, say, 1,000 years to reassess. The Devourer swarm, now sitting in a metaphoric waiting room it could not leave, processed this. The Admiral held his breath. The entire bridge crew watched their main viewer. The Devourer transmitted a single, succinct data package. It contained not a declaration of war but a confirmed appointment, a reservation, for lunch. In 1,042 years, then it turned and left, moving with the slightly embarrassed haste of someone who had just realized they were yelling in a library. Humanity's method was clear. They didn't meet force with greater force. They met dysfunction with better scheduling. They didn't defeat existential threats. They simply rescheduled them for a more convenient time, preferably after they'd had a chance to work on their issues. The Galactic Council's relief at surviving the Devourer incident curdled into profound confusion when the human representatives produced the paperwork. They expected a discussion of nebula-spanning power or lectures on cosmic responsibility. Instead, a human administrator named Janus, whose file listed his specialization as transitions and protocol, presented them with a stack of forms, compliance documents, liability waivers for reality adjustment, and triplicate impact reports on the recent Devourer rescheduling. The most powerful beings they had ever encountered were demanding their bureaucracy be filled out correctly. The tension came from the revelation that this was not a new demand. Janus, with the weary patience of an office manager explaining a filing system for the 100th time, revealed humanity had been submitting these reports for centuries. Millennia even. They hadn't been hiding their activities. They had been dutifully reporting them through the official public submission channels of every major galactic government. The problem was a simple, catastrophic misrouting. Their detailed analyses of temporal anomalies, their environmental impact statements for altering stellar evolution, their reports on neutralizing existential threats, these documents had been automatically flagged by the system. Their content was so far outside established parameters that the automated filters had one destination for such bizarre, imaginative, and impractical ideas: the division of cultural fiction and speculative philosophy. The dark comedy of the situation was almost physically painful for the council members to process. For ages, the entertainment division had been receiving what were, in fact, highly classified governance documents. A report on recalibrating the gravitational constant in Sector 7 was filed next to a screenplay about singing crystals. A strategic assessment of a nascent hive mind's psychological vulnerabilities was categorized as horror literature. Archivists in that division had awarded fictional excellence prizes to what were essentially after-action reports from reality-altering operations. Humanity's careful, meticulous documentation of their stewardship had been treated as the galaxy's most consistently inventive source of speculative fiction. Janus explained it with a logic that was both simple and utterly alien to a political mind. Power without process is chaos. Capability without documentation is a hazard. The forms, the reports, the paperwork, this was not a restriction. It was the safety mechanism. It forced consideration, created a record, and ensured that every action, no matter how universe-altering, was reviewed and justified. It was the only way to prevent a bored reality bender from redecorating a solar system on a whim. Their power was too great to be left unchecked even by themselves. Bureaucracy was the box they had built to keep their own capabilities in. The expected dramatic revelation of hidden truths was replaced by the mundane horror of administrative failure. The galaxy had anticipated a grand conspiracy. They had gotten a filing error. The council members realized with a sinking feeling that their own institutions had acted as a filter. Anything too strange, too advanced, or too true was automatically diverted into the entertainment folder. They hadn't been kept in the dark by a secretive master species. Their own paperwork algorithms had been sorting the truth into the fiction bin for thousands of years, because it was more convenient than updating their worldview. Humanity's immense power wasn't constrained by paperwork. It was channeled through it. The boring, tedious process was the only thing that made their incredible capabilities safe for the universe to tolerate. The Devourer vessel hung in the void like a monument to calculated dread. Its design language screamed silent terror, all jagged angles, pulsating necrotic energy signatures, and a hull that seemed to absorb light and hope in equal measure. It was the pinnacle of ominous threat design, a masterpiece of psychological warfare written in cold metal and violated physics. The galactic fleet facing it felt the intended effect, a cold knot of fear in every gut. They prepared for a brutal exchange of overwhelming force against overwhelming consumption. Then the human intervention began, and it started with the lighting. A soft, warm glow bloomed from within the Devourer's core, bathing its terrifying spires in a gentle, buttery light. The harsh, shadowed crevices that once suggested hidden fangs were now artfully illuminated, revealing elegant, flowing lines no one had noticed before. The pulse of malevolent energy shifted frequency, becoming a steady, pleasant hum, the kind you might expect from a well-maintained climate control system. The ship's terrifying silhouette softened. The jagged edges seemed to relax, curving into graceful Art Deco swoops and sunburst motifs. It was less an invasion and more an extreme home makeover. This wasn't merely cosmetic. The change in aesthetics directly altered the ship's function. The command deck, once a pit of shadows designed to foster paranoia and aggression, was now awash in soft light from tasteful sconces. The control interfaces, formerly jagged and intimidating, now had smooth, rounded edges and pleasing tactile feedback. The environmental systems stopped recycling a terrifying cocktail of fear pheromones and began emitting a light, calming scent of lavender and ozone. The psychological impact on the Devourer entities was immediate and profound. You cannot comfortably plot the consumption of a star system while surrounded by tasteful upholstery and excellent ambient lighting. Aggression requires a specific kind of ambiance, and this was not it. This approach stood in stark contrast to traditional military doctrine, which focuses on breaking the enemy's will through superior firepower. Humanity's focus was on life quality. They operated on the principle that intention is shaped by environment. A creature living in a cold, dark, threatening space will behave in a cold, dark, threatening manner. Improve the living conditions and you alter the behavioral patterns at their source. Why destroy a weapon when you can adjust its surroundings until the concept of being a weapon feels gauche and unnecessary? The resolution was both surreal and effective. The beautifully redesigned Devourer ship hung in space, gleaming with polished chrome and tasteful accent lighting. It was incapable of its original purpose. Its weapon systems, now seamlessly integrated into the decorative flourishes, could no longer be accessed without first navigating several menus of interior design options. The entity within, now experiencing unprecedented comfort and ergonomic support, found its all-consuming rage had been replaced by a mild desire to perhaps reupholster the command throne in a more period-appropriate fabric. Humanity's ultimate tactical maneuver was a complete lack of violence. They didn't engage in warfare. They engaged in reality remodeling, and their weapon of choice was a better, more pleasant living space. The galactic awakening arrived not with a single cathartic moment, but as a slow, creeping revision of every official record. Imagine waking up one morning to find your most cherished personal triumph, a moment of raw independence you'd built your identity upon, now footnoted with a gentle suggestion it might have been. Assisted reactions varied. The warrior cultures, proud of their hard-won victories, felt a deep, simmering betrayal. Their glorious history of conquest now read like a parent, letting a child win a wrestling match, complete with tactical notes on their form. Their glorious charge that broke the siege of Viridia, according to the newly updated archives, a human analysis of atmospheric pressure and crowd psychology had recommended a specific chant to maximize enemy confusion. Their rage was a palpable thing. Others, however, mostly the species prone to philosophical anxiety, felt an unexpected wave of relief. The universe had always been a terrifyingly random place, a chaotic mess of inexplicable disasters and inexplicable good fortune. To discover there was a pattern, however invisible, was a comfort. That time their homeworld narrowly avoided a comet strike wasn't blind luck. It was scheduled maintenance. The relief was the quiet kind that comes from realizing the roller coaster does, in fact, have safety rails, even if you couldn't see them. Institutional chaos was the immediate, practical result. Planetary databases flickered and updated in real time. The historical event, the Great Emancipation of Triton, was automatically reclassified to the Triton-guided societal restructuring. School textbooks became obsolete within hours. Archivists faced the surreal task of moving millions of documents from the historical achievement category to the applied horticultural development directory. The very language of their history was being rewritten, from a saga of independent struggle into a case study in managed growth. The moment of truth came during a system-wide review of the golden age of the Lyran Consortium. The official record, a dry chronicle of economic and artistic flourishing, now contained hyperlinks to human-submitted proposal forms. Form A734. Suggested implementation of harmonized resonance frequencies in urban planning to encourage creative output. The date of submission predated the Golden Age by exactly 50 years, the estimated time for such a project to mature. The contrast was stark. The trauma of having one's history reframed was undeniable. But the comfort of having a baffling, beautiful period of peace and prosperity finally make logical sense was, for many, a fair trade. A collective decision began to form, not through a formal vote but through a shared, dawning practicality. Fighting this new reality would be like a plant declaring war on the sun for providing photosynthesis. It was energy wasted on a futile rebellion against the fundamental conditions of its own existence. The galaxy had a choice: accept that their development had been gently, patiently guided for millennia, or cling to the belief that their entire history was a series of unimaginably lucky accidents. The first option required a certain humility. The second required a suspension of disbelief that was, frankly, more exhausting. The resolution was quiet, almost an anti-climax. There was no grand signing ceremony, no universe-altering treaty. It was a series of small administrative adjustments. Budgets were quietly reallocated from military readiness to cultural exchange programs. The official stance shifted from potential conflict to accepted partnership. The galaxy chose to accept the gardeners not as overlords but as partners in their own development. The shock of awakening to guided growth was, in the end, far less disturbing than the alternative, continuing to believe in a cosmos run by pure, random chance. The Grand Assembly Hall, a venue typically reserved for signing surrender documents or declaring wars, now hosted the most socially awkward diplomatic meeting in galactic history. The galaxy's leadership sat on one side of a polished obsidian table, their postures a mixture of deference and deep-seated anxiety. On the other side sat Iris and a few other humans, looking less like conquering demigods and more like patient tutors waiting for a particularly slow student to finish a math problem. The tension here was quiet, internal. The galaxy expected terms. They anticipated a new hierarchy, with humanity firmly at the top. They were mentally preparing their first speech as loyal subjects. The first thing Iris did was reject a prepared throne-like chair, opting for the same standard seat as everyone else. The second thing she did was clarify the fundamental misunderstanding. Humanity was not interested in ruling. The concept of a master-servant dynamic was, to them, as inefficient as it was distasteful. The partnership framework they outlined was one of guided development. Humanity would act as experienced mentors, not overlords. Their role was advisory. Their power was a tool for enabling others, not for subjugation. The goal was not to create loyal followers, but capable peers. New systems had to be designed from the ground up to accommodate this. Joint research initiatives were proposed, but with a specific caveat: all findings would be co-owned and published openly. Humanity would provide the foundational principles, the mythological framework, but the practical application and technological development would be led by mixed-species teams. The idea was to avoid creating a dependency. They weren't giving the galaxy a fish, nor were they just teaching them to fish. They were providing the blueprint for the concept of fishing, the philosophical justification for eating fish, and the environmental impact statement for the lake, then stepping back to watch them design the fishing rod themselves. This required the galaxy to accept a difficult concept. True partnership doesn't require equal capability. It requires equal respect for the potential to grow toward it. A master carpenter and a first-year apprentice are not equals in skill, but they can be partners in a project if the carpenter teaches and the apprentice learns. The expected dynamic of supreme power demanding obedience was replaced by the actual dynamic of immense experience offering tuition. The humans weren't there to give orders. They were there to answer questions. The resolution was a quiet, collective shift in perspective among the gathered leaders. They had to let go of the idea that equality meant everyone being the same right now. Humanity's entire philosophy was based on growth. Their goal was to raise other species to their level of understanding and capability, not to maintain a permanent position of superiority. A superior who wants you to remain inferior is a master. A superior who is actively working to make you their equal is a mentor. The galaxy, after a long silence, accepted the proposal. They understood that the partnership was not about their current state, but about their trajectory. True equality wasn't a starting point. It was the shared destination. It wasn't about having the same power today, but about being granted the same respect for their potential to wield it tomorrow. The first Interstellar Capability Development Center opened not with a fanfare, but with the quiet rustle of old paper and the soft glow of data slates. The classroom was a standard lecture hall, but the curriculum was anything but. On each desk sat a heavy leather-bound tome. One cover read The Labors of Hercules, another The Odyssey. The galactic students, a mix of species with various numbers of limbs and sensory organs, stared at them with a mix of confusion and profound skepticism. They had expected advanced technology, perhaps neural interfaces or quantum field manipulators. They were given mythology textbooks. The tension in the room was a thick, almost visible thing. The instructor, a human who introduced herself as a narrative methodology specialist, began by asking a simple question. What is the fundamental principle behind Daedalus's construction of the labyrinth? A Xenthian scholar, its frills fluttering with academic indignation, answered that it was a story about imprisonment and ingenuity. The instructor nodded. Also, it's a masterclass in non-repeating spatial recursion and topological manipulation. Your homework is to diagram the airflow. The revelation was slow and deeply unsettling. These human abilities weren't a piece of technology they used. They were an inherent potential, a muscle every thinking being might possess, but one only humanity had ever thought to train. The texts were not allegories. They were training manuals. A chapter on Perseus and the reflective shield was not about cleverness. It was a step-by-step guide to manipulating photonic reflection in perceptual fields. The story of Midas wasn't a moral fable about greed. It was a cautionary technical manual about the dangers of improper matter-state alteration and how to stabilize atomic cohesion. The students began to understand that every myth, every legend was a coded lesson in applied reality mechanics. The drama and the characters were just mnemonic devices, a way to make impossibly complex information memorable. Different species reacted in different ways. The reptilian Cathar, a proud warrior race, were initially insulted by what they perceived as childish stories. Then one of their number, focusing on a passage about a hero's resolve, accidentally made the air around his fist briefly shimmer with contained force. His shock was absolute. The ethereal lumen who communicated through light found the tale of Icarus not a warning, but a precise tutorial on thermal management and material stress limits. The discovery that they too might access these capabilities shifted the entire dynamic in the room. It was no longer about learning human secrets. It was about unlocking their own latent potential. This shifted the concept of human uniqueness entirely. It wasn't that they were born with a magical gift. Their uniqueness lay in their developed methodology. They hadn't found a secret. They had built a staircase, one narrative step at a time, to reach a place everyone else assumed was inaccessible. The expectation of hidden techniques, of whispered secrets and initiation rites, was punctured by the mundane reality of methodical, almost academic, development processes. The training involved meditation, focused intention exercises, and a lot of very tedious homework on metaphorical analysis. The galaxy's greatest takeaway was not a new power, but a new perspective. Humanity's true gift wasn't the reality-altering punch. It was the instruction manual for the fist. Their greatest power wasn't the incredible things they could do. It was the fact that they understood on a fundamental level how they were doing it, and more importantly, they had developed a system to teach it. The training was slow, frustrating, and often felt absurd. But across 1,000 worlds, beings began the long, strange process of learning to access what had always been inside them, guided by the oldest teachers of all, stories. The galactic bureaucracy, an entity famously resistant to change, now faced its most daunting task: a total system-wide reclassification. The directive came not from a new administration, but from a fundamental reinterpretation of reality. The forms were the same. Their purpose had shifted tectonically. The first and most awkward step was the ceremonial renaming of the Division of Cultural Fiction and Speculative Philosophy. Its new title was the considerably more sober Office of Applied Cosmological Principles. The staff, once responsible for awarding prizes for Best Short Story, now found themselves the custodians of operational manuals for reality calibration. The tension was administrative, but no less real for it. The planet's most vital governance information was now stored between a musical comedy database and the fan fiction archives. The redesign of the filing protocols was an exercise in profound paranoia. The old system filtered data based on preset parameters of plausibility. Any submission too strange was shunted to the fiction bin for being essentially too interesting. The new system operated on a principle of mandatory consideration. It could no longer dismiss an idea for being implausible. Its new job was to assess an idea's potential operational utility, no matter how absurd it sounded. A proposal to resolve a trade dispute by teaching both parties to juggle would no longer be auto-filed under comedy. It would be forwarded to the diplomatic corps with a note. Suggested methodology for bilateral kinetic mediation. Assess gravitational and focus-based conflict resolution potential. This forced a complete cultural shift. Paperwork had long been viewed as the galaxy's primary obstacle to progress, a labyrinth of red tape designed to smother good ideas. Now it was being recast as the essential enabling framework. The human's patient explanation was that a form was a thinking tool. It forced you to structure a thought, to consider consequences, to create a record. For beings who could alter the fabric of space with a whim, this wasn't obstruction. It was the only safety net that worked. The most powerful species in known space valued a properly filled-out triplicate form above almost anything else. The irony was not lost on the junior clerks. The expectation, of course, was that such advanced beings would simplify everything. They would cut through the red tape with wave of a hand. The reality was the opposite. The new systems were more complex, more detailed, more obsessed with cross-references and appendices than anything that had come before. Where the old systems sought efficiency, the new systems sought absolute precision. A simple request to adjust a star's brightness now required a 300-page environmental impact statement, a cultural sensitivity analysis for any species who might see it, and a philosophical justification for the very concept of luminance. The complexity wasn't a bug. It was the entire point. It forced a level of consideration that made irresponsible use of power a logistical impossibility. The galaxy, after considerable grumbling, adopted the new view. They began to see their bureaucracies not as obstacles but as the foundational lattice upon which a stable reality was built. A misplaced decimal point in a budget report was a nuisance. A misplaced decimal point in a spatial geometry adjustment form could turn a solar system into a particularly interesting pretzel. The resolution was a quiet, universal acceptance of a new galactic standard. The most critical security protocol wasn't a shield or a weapon. It was a flawless filing system. A properly categorized and cross-referenced document was far more effective at preventing a reality breach than a fleet of warships. The paperwork was the peacekeeper. The Galactic Institute for Applied Ontology had become the unlikely center of the new scientific revolution. Its analysts now spent their days not with quantum field equations, but with annotated copies of the Iliad. They were under strict instructions to treat these texts not as literature, but as technical documentation. The initial reports were met with considerable professional skepticism. Then they found the tolerances. A passage describing Achilles' shield didn't just mention its divine craftsmanship, it specified the precise metaphysical alloy composition, the requisite vibrational frequency for forging, and the optimal emotional state of the smith. The story of Icarus's flight included exact thermal coefficients for wax-based adhesives under solar radiation, and a detailed stress analysis of avian bone structure. The tension in the room shifted from academic doubt to a kind of horrified wonder. They were reading operational manuals disguised as bedtime stories. The archetypes were the real breakthrough. A hero, a trickster, a craftsman, these weren't just character tropes. They were functional categories, mnemonic devices for organizing complex operational data. Remembering how to recalibrate a star's core required not a 1,000-page technical manual, but internalizing the story of a hero stealing fire. The narrative provided the emotional and situational context necessary to encode the information in long-term memory. The journey, the obstacles, the resolution. Each story beat corresponded to a step in a complex physical process. You learned the procedure by learning the myth. The framework was simply more effective for transferring certain types of knowledge, especially those involving intention and nonlinear cause and effect. This stood in stark contrast to standard technical documentation. A galactic engineering manual for spatial folding was a dry list of equations, material specifications, and safety warnings. The human manual for the same procedure was the story of a magical tent that was bigger on the inside. The dry manual told you what to do. The story made you understand why it worked, embedding the principles in a framework of wonder and consequence that was impossible to forget. One was a list of ingredients. The other was the recipe, complete with helpful pictures and a cautionary tale about what happens if you overcook it. The ultimate revelation was a shift in how information itself was viewed. The galaxy had always stored its most important data in protected servers and crystalline data cubes. Humanity had chosen a different medium, culture. They encoded their most vital operational knowledge in stories, songs, and art, ensuring its survival and transmission across generations without the risk of data corruption or technological obsolescence. A song about a mystical forge would outlast any hard drive. A children's fable about a tortoise and a hare contained more usable data on temporal perception and kinetic energy management than the entire library of physics texts. The galaxy, after a period of adjustment, began to incorporate this thinking. Their own development programs started to look less like classroom lectures and more like storytelling sessions. Engineers studied epic poetry. Diplomats analyzed family sagas. The resolution was a quiet but profound change in their approach to knowledge itself. They finally comprehended that humanity's vast library of myths and legends was not their cultural pastime. It was their primary data storage and retrieval system, a system with perfect redundancy, elegant compression, and a user interface based entirely on narrative comprehension. It was, by every measure, the most robust and efficient information technology ever developed.